Jesus used the mustard seed as a parable for the kingdom of God. Now, you'll often hear me using the word kingdom, and that's a future sermon. But what it's really about is, when Jesus teaches about the kingdom of God, is nothing like a kingdom that anybody understands, and therefore kingdom isn't a great translation. And so many people have moved to use the word kingdom, as in family, the family of God to come. So in these contexts of mustard seeds, we learn that the signs of the kingdom of God can be small, minuscule, tiny, and be sown into something wonderful and broad, like a mustard shrub. We learn that sometimes the kingdom is hidden, like a seed in the ground, or that it takes time for it to take root and develop and grow into something meaningful. And we learn that God often exceeds our expectations, just about what God can do with very little. Jesus also used the mustard seed as a metaphor of faith. When the disciples asked that Jesus increase their faith, Jesus tells them that if they had the faith of a tiny little mustard seed, they would be able to do the impossible. Uproot a mulberry tree and have it take root in the sea. In Matthew, Jesus tells the disciples that even faith can move mountains. In Luke's Gospel, the saying of the mustard seed and faith is placed with a short series of teachings about discipleship. Don't be the cause of another person's failings. Forgive again and again. Even if one fails you 7 times a day and asks for forgiveness, forgive. That's Luke's version of the 70 times 7 reading. Even small faith is sufficient. And discipleship isn't about reward. I'm sure you've all heard many sermons on mustard seed and how God can do a lot with just a little, or how God's kingdom appears to be tiny but actually has tremendous potential. I really don't have anything new to add to the metaphor. And I think it was last year when I was in Petaluma that I actually had that picture of a guy about my height standing in front of a bush that was 4 times as wide as him and twice as high. It might be easy for us to read quickly through or read over the passages about mustard seeds, or miss what God is trying to say to us today about faith and the kingdom. So inspired by a sermon by D. Benson, what I would like to do this morning is to propose a series of what-ifs, to kind of reset the scene maybe, or take another look at the mustard seed and perhaps help us think freshly about what the saying might mean for us. What faith so small might mean for us. What if Jesus was implying that the faith of the disciples was even less than the size of a mustard seed? And still, God could do something with them. The reality of the mulberry bush being uprooted and planted in the sea is assumed to be untrue for the sake of argument. Mulberry bushes simply don't behave that way. The suggestion that is perhaps being made to the disciples that if faith was the size of a mustard seed, we could accomplish the utterly improbable. Moving mountains or uprooting a mulberry tree and replanting it in the sea. Imagine what God could do with even less. It's unclear as to whether Jesus was chastising the disciples for their lack of faith or if he was just trying to reassure them. The point isn't about how much faith we have, or a little or a lot, but more about what God does according to his own will, to God's own purposes, and God's own kingdom rule. Jesus multiplied loaves and fishes in the face of utter doubt of disciples. What if the mustard seed is really about the power of God in the face of something so small it might as well not exist? Something so small as 12 men and a couple of strong women standing against an empire. What if the faith that Jesus is talking about with respect to mustard seed isn't necessarily about something we believe God can do, but about being faithful in the smallest of things? In many instances, when the Bible talks about faith, it is talking about faithfulness. Active participation in and obedience to God's covenant with God's people. That is modeled after Christ's own faithfulness to the Creator. Faithfulness is about faithful, loving obedience. I find it curious that saying that follows the disciples' request for Jesus to increase their faith is about a servant and a slave who is doing their job as a servant and shouldn't expect any special treatment for doing what they're supposed to do. This servant-slave was actively doing their job according to the will of their master. They're being faithful. That in itself shouldn't be remarkable or extraordinary. It's just what you do. Just what is expected of each of us. I wonder how often we feel disappointed or overlooked when we go about our daily lives being as faithfully obedient as we can be, and no one seems to notice, or much less God. And because we feel undervalued, we start to get resentful because we aren't getting the acknowledgement or the break we believe we are entitled to. And then we start getting judgmental about all the other people out there who aren't doing as much as we are to be faithful, loving disciples. And then we end up being frustrated and bitter and self-righteous. All because we were doing what was expected of us in the first place. Being faithful, obedient servants. If you think about it, it's actually the issue of being the prodigal brother. The guy who always did what he was supposed to do and then got resentful because his brother got a party when he was doing what he wasn't supposed to do. Theologian David Luce says that faith or faithfulness is like a muscle. It needs to be worked and exercised, or it atrophies and becomes rigid and stiff and limited in its movement. What if Jesus was reminding us that the reward of God's kingdom reign among us might be good enough? You're good enough. I'm good enough. And what if Jesus were telling us that if we were more faithful in the small things, more attentive, intentional about our service, about our discipleship, God might grow a pretty amazing kingdom out of that? What if Jesus was encouraging us to move forward in faithfulness, even when we don't see any evidence of it, or we don't see the kingdom vision in front of us, or when the evidence we do see is so small it might as well be invisible? There is a powerful scene that demonstrates this idea in, forgive me, Indiana Jones. Indiana Jones in the Last Crusade. On his journey to discover and protect the Holy Grail, Dr. Jones, the younger, Harrison Ford, must literally step out in faith on the side of a cliff trusting that something will keep him from falling into the abyss below. There is absolutely no sign of a bridge or any other way to cross. But he steels himself up and takes a deep breath and steps out into nothingness. Kind of scrunches up his face, but does it anyway. And it's not so much the leap of faith that was remarkably heroic that I think is important for us today. Instead, I wonder how many times we allow what we can't see to hold us back, to keep us from trusting God, to keep us from trusting God to be God. You ever have that thing in you that you just feel needs to be done, but you don't want to be the one to take that first step? Take that deep breath and step into the abyss, trusting that maybe that small voice, that little urging, might be God's way of saying, I'm going to make this little nudge something bigger. Sometimes we look out over the abyss and don't see any way across. And that abyss can be anything. Not enough money to pay the bills or buy groceries, something that God is calling you to something wonderful but not seeing how it can be done. Repairing a broken relationship. The difficulty to keep forgiving or overcome an addiction. But what if there is a way? Even if it is so small, we can't see it. Or so extraordinary that we can't believe it. What if we stop limiting the outworking of God's kingdom in our midst to our own imaginations? And what if we can readily see what might be? What if we trusted that God's power is beyond our imagination? Might we be just as surprised as if we were to see a mulberry tree uprooted and transplanted in the sea? There is a constant call that churches and congregations must struggle with. That is, do we step boldly in faith and trust in God? Or do we overanalyze everything, panic about where the money may come from, or do we hold our breath and wait for God to just do it? If it's supposed to happen, God will make it happen. It's not the rules of discipleship. If you feel there's a ministry, a possibility, a way that we can make a difference in the world, it starts with one person going, I have this idea. You check with your brothers and sisters to make sure you're not crazy. You reel them in, and you get going on it. I suspect that's mostly how every darn event that's happening in the next 5 weeks got started. Somebody went, I have an idea. And now we have a rummage sale, we have a Christmas show, we have a Christmas sale, we just had the meat and ham supper, we have a concert coming up. We'll breathe in January. But that's what it's about. It's that spark that started it all. Somebody had to say, I have an idea. I feel this calling. We can make a difference in our community. Have some fun doing it and maybe even raise $1 or $2 so we can do more. As we move into communion, this meal is a mustard seed meal. It seems small and insignificant when it's just dust around the table. What goes on here sometimes seems invisible to the rest of the world. We often don't understand the miracle of it. We don't see how God can be doing anything with us or in us in these simple elements of bread and juice, but perhaps this meal seems so meaningless to us that it might as well be invisible, a non-thing. But what if this meal was about God's power and not what we do? This simple meal, this intentional taking of bread and juice together can be taken for granted. But being World Communion Sunday, we know there are places in this world where on a Sunday, the piece of bread one receives may be all they have to eat that day. Last year in the Congo, there was an outbreak of Ebola virus. There is no cure for Ebola, and it is easily spread. What would you do as a church if this is what you had to face on a Sunday? To begin with, hand washing stands were placed outside the church in Madaka. I hope I said that right. When the time for communion came, the elders prayed over the emblems as they usually do, and then brought them down in front of the pulpit. The ushers dismissed each pew to proceed to the front of the church to wash their hands again and receive an application of hand sanitizer. Then they could partake of the bread and the cup, depositing the empty cup into a bucket and returning to their pew. The process was smooth and was in no way disruptive to the overall worship experience. But one can see, or almost feel, how sacred a crumb of bread can become. So, what if in this meal something big and extraordinary is happening? People all over the world are taking part in this same sacrament this morning because it is World Communion Sunday. People all over the world are coming together as Christ's body to proclaim the power of his resurrection and the breaking in of God's kingdom among us. People all over the world are being empowered by the Spirit of Jesus to point to this great big mustard plant called the kingdom, which branches enough for everyone. What is in this meal? The kingdom is sown in us. Too tiny to be seen, a planting of grace, of sacrifice and love and new life. Let's taste and see what the Lord has done. And so today we honor the sacred, to honor the Christians all over the world with their multiple understandings, their different dogma. We will lift the one thing that joins us together, the one bread that makes us one body. Now today, because of World Communion Sunday, we have a few different samples of bread from around the world. We have 2 cups, because we're going to invite everybody to come forward and partake in that way. The bread is already broken up. You'll have your choice of flavor, and you'll receive the blessing of the bread of life and the cup of salvation when we do communion. And just as a mustard seed can grow into a wild bush, so can a piece of bread and a sip of juice set the kingdom of God alight.